Welcome back to Business Ethics. I'm Tom, and this video is discussing corporate culture, right? So we talked a bit about social dynamics, and this video is discussing specifically the idea of kind of cultural phenomena or systemic issues, right? We've talked about stakeholders. One kind of important group of stakeholders are your employees, right? And your employees and the way in which they work together can be shaped and has different dynamics in ways that are kind of unique to kind of like a group mindset, right? Now they talk in the book about the difference between like organizational culture and corporate culture. Very simply, when we're talking about organizational culture, we're talking about the culture of any organization, whereas corporate culture is specific to corporations, right? So, um, and when we're talking about culture, we're talking about the norms, the habits, the activities of an actual group of people, right? And this is maybe contrasted with something like a code of conduct or a rule book, right? The culture of a business is not necessarily what is written down in the mission statement or not necessarily what is written down in code of conduct, because sometimes, that code of conduct is neglected and sometimes it is followed and sometimes it's followed and kind of cherry picked in certain ways, right? So I mean, one example I always give students is to think about MSU's code of conduct. There's a student code of conduct. um, some of it we know just kind of offhand, right? Like you shouldn't cheat or whatever, but on a test. But for the most part, most of us have never looked at it. We haven't had to. It doesn't really express the culture of MSU Denver, right? When you have a company, right, it has to do with the way people actually behave. Right. So which rules do they endorse? Which rules do they not endorse? And how do they endorse them? Right. Are they very sticklers for the rule? Are they a little bit more loosey goosey, right? That kind of stuff. Now, the thing about culture that is unique, I mean, there's a couple of things, but one is that, pretty much everything you do when you get a group of people together shapes that culture, right? The way people talk to each other, when they show up for work, when they leave, who talks to who, what tone of voice, how often they talk, all that kind of stuff, how close they work together, all those kinds of things really set a tone, right? That people tend to follow. And sometimes they don't, right? And that also can be a cultural phenomenon where you have a lot of discord within a company, or people can kind of separate into two groups, right? Like people who work from home versus people who think you should come to the office or whatnot. You look at companies that have very kind of, what would you say, kind of open-ended, casual kind of work policies where people are sitting around on bean bags and their laptops or something like that. And some people might reject that and they want to go to their cubicle and stuff like this or whatnot. All of those things constitute cultural norms, right? Patterns of behavior, right? That people can resist or can kind of fall into. And these kind of cultural norms are inescapable, right? Whatever you do, if you get a group of people together, they have to talk to each other. So they will talk at in some tone of voice, right? Whether you like it or not. A good example of this is think about a workplace where and think about leaving late, right? When you go to work, everyone has to leave at some point, right? They can leave at 5 o'clock when they're supposed to, or they can leave early, right? If and that can set a kind of standard, right? Think about if everyone starts leaving, your work day ends at 5, but everyone starts leaving at 4:15, right? Then you start to think, well, what am I doing here? Why don't I just leave at 4:15 like everyone else, right? It kind of sets that dynamic in motion. Or more often than not, it's the opposite, right? Everyone stays till 7:30, right? And now, even though they're not supposed to stay there in terms of like the official rule, um, it's kind of taken as a standard that everyone works late, right? And if you don't work late, now you're lazy, right? You're not really putting in your time, right? These are the kind of cultural dynamics um, that are kind of just implicit. They just occur, right? And the reason why we mention this is because, again, with like this kind of idea of organizational health, um, if you don't pay attention to these dynamics, they're liable to get away from you, right? And they have a kind of mind of their own, right? I also mention in my notes about the difference between an individual issue and a systemic issue, right? Um, we have a tendency to want to treat systemic issues like individual issues, right? And I'll talk about that in a minute, but they tend to not work very well, right? When you do this. So I give the example of kind of like a systemic problem. This is kind of like a high level systemic problem. And I talk about in my notes, I give the example of a privatized police force, right? Policing is thought to be and is a public good, right? Um, and the reason why it's a public good is because making it privatized is almost, a surefire. It kind of it. What would you say? Uh, Cultivates corruption, right? Because a privatized police force would basically mean that someone owns the police, right? And it's going to be kind of inherently unfair to do that, right? It should be a public good, and no one person should be really in charge, right? They should be accountable to kind of general policies and rules. And if you think, well, what if the person who owns the cops, right, is a good person, and they make good decisions, right, and they do the right thing. Um, Insofar as they do the right thing, right, they're actually going to start to relinquish that power, right? Maybe they set up a board, a group of 7 or 8 individuals that vote on policies about how the police should conduct themselves and stuff like this. And when you're doing that, then you're making it more into a public good, right? So a real good owner of the police would actually not take on that power, right? And it has to do with just the fact that the structure, right, the system itself is not a good one. It breeds corruption, right? And what that means is that really it's not about the owner of the police force being a good person or a bad person. It's really about putting into place a system that is going to have kind of checks and balances in it, right? And kind of decentralizing that process, right? And so when I talk about, kind of more local issues, right? And the difference between like a systemic issue and individual issue, you can think of, let's think of one example, right? You run a construction company, you do commercial construction, and you use a lot of heavy machinery, and you have an individual, Bill, who comes to work and he's always drunk, and Bill crashes one of the machines and injures himself and someone else, right? Well, the problem there is that Bill drinks too much, right? And so what do? Well, you either fire Bill or you send Bill to rehab, right? And that's going to solve that problem. Now, um, conversely, you might think that like actually in that industry, let's say everyone at lunch goes off and has a few beers, right? And it's just part of the culture, right? Now, and the same thing happens, Bill gets in an accident. Well, firing Bill or removing Bill from that situation is not going to change the cultural norm that everyone's drinking, right? You're going to continue to have accidents. People are going to continue to be intoxicated in the workplace. You have to create a different strategy to kind of change that cultural norm, right? Make it such a case that where people are not drinking regularly, right? Or something like this, right? Another kind of version of this is you can think of people who get injured in the workplace, and if really your expectations for productivity are too high and you're skimping on safety procedures and people are working too fast and they're working too hard, too long hours, and they're skipping breaks, then dealing with one person getting injured is not going to solve that problem. You have to change more general features of your line of productivity to make it more of a generally safe kind of place, right? So that's kind of recognizing the systemic issues, right? Something that if you removed one person, it wouldn't really change the situation, right? And also in businesses, this is usually the case that hiring someone new, they tend to get absorbed by that culture, right? And they end up kind of behaving in a similar fashion, right? Or they quit, right? This kind of thing. So you need to kind of deal with cultural issues in a different way, right? They mentioned also in the book a few different kinds of culture, right? Apathetic, caring, etc. You can look at those; those are pretty straightforward. And then they also talk about different kinds of power dynamics, reward power, coercive power. Those are good to kind of know about. I'm not going to go over them here, but that's it for today. Thank you for watching. I will see you all soon.